Morning, Lord Patten.
Morning.
Let me explain the arrangements. You are talking, obviously, to the group in front of you, a large group in Aldwych House. But beyond them, you are talking also to the lawyers on your left, the press at the back, and more particularly a large group, unknown in exact number, but it'll probably be in three figures somewhere, who are watching on YouTube and on live stream.
Thank you.
What you say is recorded for posterity, both in transcript form
Yes.
and in visual form.
I'll be cautious.
Well, you know what there is. You need to know, and that's why I'm telling you. In a moment or two, Ms. Richards will start the questioning, but first, Mary will ask you to take the oath. Mary.
Please state your full name.
John Haggett Charles Lord Patten.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give,
shall be the truth,
the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Amen.
Lord Patten, you became a Member of Parliament in 1979, is that right?
Correct.
And you remained the MP for Oxford until 1997.
First of all, it was for Oxford in the first session of Parliament. Then the Parliamentary Commissioners divided the constituency into two, and it became Oxford, West and Abingdon. But effectively, I did 4 full terms until I stood down of my own choice at the general election.
And you then became a member of the House of Lords.
Yes.
I'm just going to ask you briefly to go through your various political roles, but we'll do it by reference to your witness statement, which sets them out. So, Lawrence, could we please have WITN 5297001? And we'll go to page 5. So, bottom half of the page, we can see your various roles. Between 1980 and January 1981, you were Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Ministers of State at the Home Office.
Correct.
You then, between January 1981 and June 1983, were based in the Northern Ireland Office as Parliamentary Under Secretary of State.
Correct. It was a double-headed location, but substantially in the province and partially in London.
And then on the 14th of June 1983 through to the 2nd of September 1985, you became Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Health in the Department of Health and Social Security. And obviously, my questions will be focused upon that time.
Of course.
You then, in September 1985, moved to the Department of the Environment, and you were Minister of State there between September 1985 and June 1987.
Yes.
You then took up a post as Minister of State in the Home Office between June 1987 and April 1992.
Yes.
And then you became Secretary of State for Education and Science between April 1992 and July 1994.
Yes.
And that was your last ministerial post.
That was my last ministerial post, yes.
We can take that down, thank you. Now, the inquiry is aware that there have been other inquiries looking at matters relevant to infected blood. There was an independent inquiry called the Archer Inquiry and a Scottish inquiry called the Penrose Inquiry. Were you asked to give evidence to either of those inquiries as far as you can recall?
No.
So would it be right to understand this is the first time you've been asked questions about your time at the Department of Health on matters relevant to infected blood?
Just so, or indeed in any other aspect of my work in public service in the Department for Health and Social Security.
And you make clear in your statement, and it's perhaps useful to draw this out at the beginning of your evidence, you've not got any independent memory now of the matters about which I'm going to be asking you. Your account as set out in your written statement is based solely upon the documentation that's been made available to you. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. And if I may give one example of that, the great epidemiologist Dr. Fauci, who is advisor at the moment to the President of the United States and previously was advisor to the previous President of the United States. And apparently, according to the record, I met him at a meeting in Washington in 1985 and would like to be able to say, I discussed these matters with Dr. Fauci, but I've got no memory whatsoever. And he is a leading epidemiologist, as he has been throughout the whole COVID issue in the United States, and is now functioning fully in his mid-80s.
So as we go through the various issues I'm going to explore with you, we'll look at some of the underlying documents that you've made reference to in your statement and do the best we can by reference to the documents. I'm going to start by asking you some general questions about the Department of Health and Social Security at the time you were there. Throughout your time there, is it right that the Secretary of State was Norman Fowler and the Minister of State Kenneth Clarke?
Yes, on the health side of that huge, sprawling department.
Yes, and we'll leave aside any issues relating to social security. Lord Glenarthur took up the role of Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State in the House of Lords. At the same time, you took up the equivalent role in the House of Commons, is that right?
Correct.
And then Lord Glenarthur...
I didn't know his lordship before we met then.
And Lord Glenarthur was succeeded by Baroness Trumpington in late March 1985.
Yes.
Now, we've heard from Lord Glenarthur, and we know from his evidence and from your statement that the particular responsibility for blood and blood products fell within Lord Glenarthur's portfolio of responsibilities.
Exactly, and exactly as the inquiry directed me to do, I carefully read Simon Glenarthur's evidence in some detail.
But we'll hear as we go through the documents and look at parts of your statement. You had some involvement in the department's decision-making during that period, 1983 to 1985. And I just want to explore in general terms with you why that was.
Decision-making on?
Decision-making on matters relevant to blood and blood products. So one of the reasons, as I understand it from your statement, is that Lord Glenarthur was based in the House of Lords, and so there might be occasions where someone in the House of Commons had to deal with an issue. So you would, if a statement was to be made in the House of Lords by Lord Glenarthur on an area falling within his responsibility, you might be called upon to deal with the matter in the House of Commons. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And in effect, I acted as Lord Glenarthur's understudy on matters concerning all the broad health issues, including infected blood, as it later became known, sadly. And I had to do effectively what he wished to do on advice. And in exactly the same way, Lord Glenarthur, when he was answering questions which came within my remit, like, for example, the special hospitals, as they were then called in London, the Royal Marsden, the Brompton Heart Hospital or whatever, he effectively was acting, if I may use that word again, he was my understudy. And so we shared a lot of information with each other. And obviously he picked up things in the world, in the House of Lords, not just from people in our party, about their issues in health, which he'd sometimes share with me informally. And I picked up stuff in the House of Commons where the whole issue of AIDS, as it became known at the time, post-1981, and sometimes infected blood, was raised with me by passing members of the House of Commons, which is a normal way in which parliamentary political business is done, by which I don't mean partisan political business, this party or that party, but you pass each other and they say, look, I'm worried about this. What are you going to do about it? So we would share that sort of feel, because we do not have, forgive me for going on so long, we do not have two houses. There is Parliament with two houses, but Parliament's a unified body, and so there's a lot of toing and froing.
You've also said in your statement that decision-making, ministerial decision-making, was to some extent collegiate. Could
Correct.
you expand upon that?
Yes. I can remember when I first went, or soon after, I can't ascribe a date to it, Norman Fowler, for whom I have great respect, told me to be active and to take an interest in what was going on. I can remember the conversation happened in a lift, but the way in which things are sometimes. But he said, get on with things, take an interest in general policy issues, and be on the front foot. And that I took as a clear ministerial instruction to be involved in giving my views on policy making, which is not the same as taking a decision to do this or that. And I did that freely, and incidentally it was something that subsequently I was told in all the other ministerial roles I had, in the Department for the Environment, in the Home Office, and indeed it's an instructional request I can remember giving to my own junior ministers when I was a cabinet minister. So it was perfectly natural to have those sorts of discussions. And we also every week with Norman Fowler, sometimes with an official presence, sometimes not, a session, normally a Monday morning meeting, as it were, where for half an hour or more, ministers would get together and have a talk about matters informally, what was going on, how we were going to handle it, what difficulties we were in. And we did often get into difficulties across a whole range of issues, not just in matters of infected blood and its horrors. And sometimes there would be an official brought in to take a note of what we were thinking, and it could then be passed on down the line. Ministers this morning at their private meeting felt that, let's get a move on something or another. And that, of course, the records are never taken. But it's quite an important part of the way in which ministers conduct their business. So I, in my mind, divided my responsibilities, whatever they were, into two halves. One was a contribution to political policy making and policy making in the broad, and the other was taking decisions in areas where I was specifically responsible. I revert to the special hospitals, and let's say if there was a bid in during the public expenditure round from the Brompton Heart Hospital for more money to do X, then I would take that decision subject to the overall oversight of the Secretary of State, Norman Fowler. And that's an example of characteristic decision making. And I see a difference between contributions to policy debates and actual decision, what you might call a wet signature, as I understand it in the legal world, on some document. Do this.
Do you know how the different areas of responsibility were allocated? Why it was that blood and blood products was the responsibility of the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State in the House of Lords, for example, and you had special hospitals and the Brompton and a range of other matters. Did you have any understanding of how that division was made?
Absolutely none.
So
I just took my orders, forgive me. There wasn't, I believe, a first day brief for me, or indeed for Lord Glenarthur, except of a sort of general sort, which would be the equivalent of the brief when a government changes, when there's an enormous document produced by the civil service, and very good too, prepared for whichever government's coming in. And at that stage, there might have been some rationale set out, but I have no knowledge of that at all. So
would this be right? You'd essentially start on the 14th of June 1983 in the department. You'd be, in a sense, thrown in at the deep end. You'd be expected to learn on the job.
Yes.
And then just in terms of how information got to you as a minister, you had a private office.
Yep.
And you've explained in your statement that, for example, a submission from civil servants that was directed for your attention, you would expect that undoubtedly to come to you through your private office. But is this right? If it was something that was being directed to another minister but copied to you, there might then be a judgment to be made by your private office as to whether you needed to see the document.
Yeah. I mean, I remember with gratitude the two private secretaries I had, Janet Walden and then Jane McKeswick, who often went far beyond the bounds of duty to make sure everything was going well. They were having to deal on a daily basis, and particularly when going through the almost ceremonial decision as to what to put in the box of ministerial reading for the weekend, which is a sort of classic time. You've got ministers to really pay attention on the Saturday or Sunday because they're not actually in Parliament being diverted. And they got a very difficult job sometimes. You know, if it was a decision for me, then it's a decision for me subject to going up to escalation through the MSH, through Kenneth Clarke, and upwards to Norman Fowler with my recommendation. We should do this, spend this, the other. But a lot of stuff was sent for information, so we were all kept up to speed. You understand that shorthand all too well. And the documents would then effectively have to be, I can't think of any other word, weeded by the private office, by the private secretary, to say yes or no to that going into the box for that night or the weekend box. And it was quite a serious judgment for relatively junior, although experienced DHS civil servants to make that judgment, and it wasn't easy.
And then, again...
I'm sorry, could I also add that I do not think I was ever in want of information. We had a sort of information load which was considerable because of the way in which the health service was then organised. It was a matter of them deciding, is this something he should have a view on, and if so, do I put it in the box or not?
And I just want to pick up on that a little more, that the question of how a civil servant might decide what should go to a minister or not. I just want to ask you about something in your witness statement. So could we have the statement back on screen, please, Lawrence? WITN 5297001. And if we go to page 10, please. If we look at the paragraph at the bottom of the page, paragraph 2.8, and Lord Patten, this is not concerned here with the question of the private office deciding what goes into the ministerial red box. This is a broader question of when does a civil servant within the Department of Health decide if a submission needs to be made to ministers or not. And you say here the relevant policy and medical civil servants had to exercise judgment on when to come to ministers, whether for a decision or to update them. There are some categories where ministerial submissions were obviously required, a change of policy or significant new spending commitments being obvious examples. Now, just pausing there, if we leave aside the new spending commitments, because I think that's fairly self-evident, change of policy, what kind of circumstance would that encompass?
Well, I know we're coming to section 5 and the whole testing issues later on, but during the formulation of the eventual policy, there were a number of iterations in that process. And I guess from reading the documents that I saw at the time, we thought this, then we thought that, then we thought, no, let's do it this way. And then the Secretary of State said, this is what you're going to do. So I think that was how the process worked.
It might be said, certainly from some of the other material that the inquiries looked at, that a trigger sometimes for a submission going to ministers was the concern about media interest or adverse press comment. Would that be another reason why something might come to a minister's attention? Surely.
That was particularly the case in 1983, when there was a lot of misinformation and unhelpful information about the growth of AIDS and related matters in the press, and the tabloids were going well beyond their normal restraint, which is not very heavy, to say terrible things sometimes. And you have to react. You can't say, well, they're wrong. You have to say what the reasons are. So there'd be a lot of stuff. Particularly, I remember the press office with the cover of the relevant civil servant late on Friday, when they got to hear what was in the Sunday newspapers that was coming along. There'd be cries, we must have briefing for this, what we say to the Sundays. Because although you would think the Sunday newspapers are written on a Saturday in those days, they weren't. Generally speaking, they're written on a Friday night. And then the journalists would be going out as a matter of politeness to say we're about to tell the world that one of your ministers, whoever, is behaving monstrously, and what's your response to this? So they can put at the end, well, we asked the department and they said, well, he or she is not a bad person, or whatever it is.
We can take that down, thank you. Can I ask you next then, still at a general level, about interactions with the Chief Medical Officer or Deputy Chief Medical Officers? We'll see when we get to testing in 1985 that you were obviously by 1985 having some regular interactions with the Chief Medical Officer, Donald Aitchison.
With Sir Donald, yeah.
Earlier than that, 83, 84, do you have any recollection or any sense of the extent to which you had dealings with the Chief Medical Officer or his deputies?
I never, to the best of my knowledge, met Sir Henry Lees. I think there's only one document in my pile actually signed by him, written in an unusual way in parts. And I may well have been formally introduced at some moment, but I cannot recall any meeting that I had with him. I can remember quite early on various people who were on the medical side giving advice, but I had no interaction whatsoever until Sir Donald came along, who was, I thought, and I mustn't go over the top here, but I thought was the epitome of openness and good to see you and how are things going and how's the family, and stopping in the corridor or whatever and having a cup of coffee and talking and wanting to, by doing that, I think probably in a very kindly way, wanted to coach new junior ministers about what they should be aware of, and that I welcomed. And he was a great policy man. I mean, obviously he was the nation's Chief Medical Officer. He had to take serious decisions about national issues over what would happen, I don't know, in a nuclear attack, and were we resilient or not, all of that stratum, as well as being the Chief Medical Officer for England and Wales, which is, I think, what he was the rest of the time. And he was a very good coach, very open, responded quickly to whatever was going on, lots of informal talks, I guess.
And was there any system of regular meetings between ministers and the Chief Medical Officer, or was it a question of as and when the need arose, you might have a meeting with him?
The latter. Just as we had on a Monday morning ministers meeting, it was called ministers when you all got together and talked privately, we never had a slot in the diary to see CMO, because he was in an almost Olympian position. And I regarded him as someone of great importance.
When you would be answering questions in the House of Commons or making a statement in the House of Commons, and again, I'm talking more generally here about your time at the Department of Health, not about any specific answer. What was the briefing process? What kind of information might you be given in general to equip you to deal with an issue in the House of Commons?
Well, there would be a mountain of briefing when we had the monthly, if it was monthly, session of questions on the floor of the House of the Secretary of State for Health, parliamentary questions. And there would be voluminous documentation given to one. And if you wanted it, you ask for the particular official to come up and have a chat about what to do. The press office or press department would almost certainly be there on the general issue of communications, because that was part of their job, to fully understand what ministers were trying to say. In general terms, I'm sure during the period, particularly 1983, 1984, when there was so much unfortunate speculation in the press about the nature of AIDS and what AIDS sufferers were and who they were and what the effect on them, the terrible effect on them was, you'd get a lot of occasions, I guess, when I would ask civil servants, look, this is very difficult, I don't understand what's going on, can you please explain? So it was a very iterative process, but hand on heart, I can say I never wanted for information, and anything that I did with that information was my responsibility, not the civil servant's responsibility.
And then in terms of interactions between the Department of Health in London and Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, your statement suggests that you don't recall much direct contact with junior ministers in what I think were referred to as the territorial departments. Is that right?
That's right. The territorial ministers in those days were highly protective of their country. Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And so these issues would not be sublet to junior ministers of any sort at all, ministers of state or parliamentary undersecretaries as I was. But they'd be discussed and argued by cabinet ministers because they were each, as it were, I don't know what the word is, protecting their interests every time. And that means that either by default or policy decision, we were kept away from that kind of thing.
And your statement suggests that you think most liaison would have been done at official level,
Yeah.
civil service level, between the different departments. And then, as you say, if there were areas of dispute, that would be resolved, if it was going to be resolved at a ministerial level, by the Secretaries of State.
That's a lot of bilateralism went on, I think.
You also say that as a matter of practical reality, England would tend to lead the way in terms of policy making by virtue of its greater population and resources. Is that right?
That's right.
Can I then, before we come on to talk about some of the decisions that you were involved with at the Department of Health, just ask you very briefly about your time in Northern Ireland?
Yes.
And as a reminder of the dates, you were at the Northern Ireland office in a junior ministerial capacity between January 1981 and June 1983. I think this is right from your statement. You've no recollection of any involvement in or discussion of issues relating to blood products or AIDS whilst you were in Northern Ireland, is that right?
That's correct. I cannot remember any submission coming to me, and indeed, to me it seems sad, wrong, and possibly a tragedy that no documentation seems to exist in the Northern Ireland office. I don't know what the archiving was, but there's absolutely nothing that I can point to, or indeed learned counsel could point to and say, look, there's a document. So I think that's correct, and quite a forgive me, quite a chunk of my life in Northern Ireland, in the Northern Ireland office, the NIO, was spent in Northern Ireland, and in parallel to any responsibilities I might have had on general policy, I was also quite deeply involved in various security issues, which I won't go into, but it meant that sometimes for sustained periods, I was the duty minister, and if there was something which required a ministerial decision, and I think I could say this without naming names, if someone needed to be held for questioning for another 48 hours, I'd have a submission for this and people would come and talk to me about it. And I would say yes or no on my own say-so. It didn't go back to London. That was, amazingly enough, a junior minister's decision on advice.
And just picking up again from your statement, I don't think we need it on screen, Lawrence, but you've said in your statement that health and social services issues did fall within your area of responsibility. Correct. In the Northern Ireland office, but that your time was, I think, largely taken up with security and political aspects arising out of the trouble.
Did I say largely? If so, I think that's
significant amount of ministerial time. I think
significant. Yes, I mean not largely, not necessarily more than 50%, but it might matter if there were bombings and or there were problems on the border where sometimes I was taken. Then that's a day or 2 days under guard going to look at this. But so it was certainly significant, but it came and went as the terrorists on both sides of the divide decided that they were going to explode or murder or do whatever else they did. So it was certainly significant.
And you said by reference to your time at the Northern Ireland office, your general recollection was that liaison with the Department of Health on health issues, again, was done at an official level rather than ministerial level. Yes,
I can never recall, and I don't know whether the Scotland office or the Welsh office now have any records of any meetings of their junior ministers with me, but there's nothing that we can find, I believe, in in the DHSS archives or indeed the Northern Ireland Office archives.
We'll come to look in due course, in the course of your evidence, at one or more of the expert advisory committees or groups that would be set up from time to time, providing advice to the Department of Health. But is this right? You as a minister did not expect to receive copies of minutes of meetings of expert advisory groups or the recommendations they were making. You would get the submission from civil servants, which might be based upon or refer to expert advice, but you wouldn't see the expert committee's decision making itself.
No, that's absolutely right, and indeed, by virtue of the very name, it was an expert committee. It was a committee, whatever it was, blood products or whatever else, that they were there to advise, and therefore, by the nature of the system, I or Norman Fowler or Ken Clark was not involved in shaping their policy. They were totally independent bodies, and I think very often quite protective of what they were doing. And that's, I think, right, because in complex medical issues, I think it's so important that people have got the chance to come to their own views and then pass it over to ministers to decide. And they're not influenced in any way at all by ministers sitting on their shoulders and saying, no, nudge it this way, nudge it that way.
Would you accept that there might be a difference between the situation you described, ministers sitting on the shoulders of the expert bodies trying to nudge them in a particular direction, which you say would be undesirable for the reasons you've given, but on the other hand, there might be a benefit from ministers being cited on the deliberations and recommendations and concerns of expert committees by, at least from time to time, being provided with sets of minutes or summaries of minutes?
Well, if so, I can't remember that. And is there anything in the archival?
No, there's nothing to suggest that did happen. I'm really just asking you generally whether you think it might have been a good idea.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood what you were saying. I'm not paying attention. I don't think it would have been a particularly good idea, because you know what it is when you've got power and influence put in your hands. You want to go on exercising it. And I would not wish to have been put in a position where I was giving, as it were, a half-time view of where this particular specialist committee had got to, because I would be inexorably drawn into forming their conclusions. And I would have thought that would have been politically, and don't want to use the word morally, but morally with a small m, wrong, because that would have meant that the committee was not independent. And the whole point of having independent committees is to have independent committees. And if you don't like it, you ignore it. And if you do like it, and sometimes are very frightened by what, or at least influenced by what independent committees were saying, then it's good to have that untarnished view put to you. So I don't think, with respect, it would have been a good idea.
Now, you've told us that when you took up your ministerial role in the Department of Health, that you didn't receive any particular initial briefing. Was that the same in the other departments?
Well, I don't think I did. We can't find it. I'm sure people came and talked to me, and I'm sure, sort of faintly remember faces being marched in, and this is so-and-so and so-and-so, and first day talk and chat. But to answer your specific question, I can remember only in the Department of Education, when I became Secretary of State, there was again almost like a first day brief, but it was enormous, and that was because it was just after a general election, and in the 1992 general election. And so, although it wasn't a change of government, the civil servants in that particular department had been tasked to prepare voluminous documents, and they were, to put in front of a incoming Secretary of State, whichever party it was. And there's a well-documented occasion, at least there was then, where an incoming Secretary of State suddenly found a couple of pages misplaced in his brief that was actually intended for another political party coming in. So, you know, you could see the attention, and I pay tribute to the way in which civil servants, in a political sense, were able to put themselves into the minds almost of other political parties, that change of government, you know, because what's coming next? And I think that's a great, or was a great attribute of the British government system. I think it's perhaps ebbed a bit at the moment in the world when there are lots of special advisors influencing matters who are not civil servants. But there wasn't a special advisor known in the Department of Health when I was there.
Now, I'm going to turn now to some of the documents that you saw at an early stage of your ministerial role. Lawrence, could we have, please, DHSC 0002309_022? You can see this is a minute dated the 28th of June 1983 from Mr. Winstanley to Mrs. Walden in your private office. The heading is AIDS, and then we can see from paragraph 1, Mr. Patten has expressed an interest in AIDS, and although ministerial responsibility for the National Blood Transfusion Service now rests with Lord Glenarthur, has asked for some information. I'm attaching a copy of a brief prepared by Dr. Wolford, Med SEB, for Lord Glenarthur. Mr. Patten may be interested to know that we shall also be putting a submission to Lord Glenarthur shortly to approve the issue of the AIDS leaflet mentioned in the brief, and within the next month, hopefully a note detailing the progress made in those areas where action is being taken or contemplated to prevent the spread of AIDS, together with recommendations. Now, I'll come on to the issue of the AIDS leaflet in a little while. But we can see here that this is 2 weeks after you've taken up your ministerial role, and it would appear from this that you have taken the initiative to ask for information about AIDS, although it wasn't at that stage part of your specific ministerial responsibilities. Do you have any, either recollection...
Sorry, can I just pause on that? Not being part of my ministerial responsibilities, but I had responsibilities connected to the provision of health services, which of course were having to deal with people who are unfortunate enough to need treatment.
Yes. And in fact, before I ask you about the document, just picking up on that, we know blood and blood products was Lord Glenarthur's responsibility. Was there a specific ministerial responsibility for AIDS itself?
Not that I can recall, and we don't have any document allocating this responsibility. I suspect, but I cannot recall why I asked for that document, but I think it was because it was just the time when there was an enormous amount of, and I'm repeating myself, I know, very unwise and unpleasant sometimes press coverage about people who were falling into the AIDS sufferers category. And I know it was very live in the House of Commons. And I suspect it was a combination of people coming up to me and saying, when are you going to stamp this out? When are you going to stop all this? It's a kind of way in which politicians sometimes speak to each other. What are you going to do about it? And it wasn't just a concern from my political party. It was right across the piece. So I suspect it was a combination of the two, but I cannot truthfully say that that's the case. This is my speculating.
We'll look at one of the documents that you were provided with. It's DHSC 0002309_124.
Just before that, if we may, before we leave that page, perhaps I should have said that Janet Walden, who is an excellent private secretary, I think in her first paragraph, because we were all new, she was treading very gently in asking for any briefing on AIDS, because there were two new ministers and with new responsibilities, and she wanted to make quite clear she wasn't taking on a responsibility from my point of view. And I think that was very good of her, and I think it's very well drafted.
So if we look at the document, a brief prepared by Dr. Wolford, if we just zoom in on the top half of the page to start with, please. So what you say in your statement, Lord Patten, just to remind you, is you expect that you would have read this, having specifically asked for it. You can't now remember what you thought about it at the time. Is that right?
No.
But I am going to just go through a handful of passages
course.
and just ask for your reflections now, doing the best that you can. So we can see paragraph 1 refers to, the first paragraph, I should say, they're not numbered, refers to AIDS as a newly recognised disease. And then under the heading symptoms, we see reference to the disease.
Please forgive me,
Yes.
is this the document which came from Sir Henry Yellowley's office?
No.
It's not, this is something else.
This is the document, as I understand your statement, and indeed the other documents.
I'd asked for.
Is part of the material put together by Dr. Wolford and that was provided
Dr. Wolford,
to you.
that's right.
Yes.
I'd forgotten her name, yeah.
So we can see under the heading symptoms, it refers to the disease coming on insidiously. It refers to there being usually delay between the occurrence of those early symptoms and the onset of disease. Mortality is at least 40% and no known cure. And then under the heading AIDS in the USA, it refers to numbers of cases reported to the Centres for Disease Control and that there's thought to be considerable underreporting, partly due to failure to diagnose less typical or milder cases. So just pausing there, would it be fair to say you'd have understood from this, first of all, that AIDS was a very serious disease?
Yes.
High mortality rate.
Yes. And it was likely to become if not a pandemic, a big issue for the National Health Service, as well as, of course, for the individual sufferers.
And would it be right to understand that, or to say that you'd also have understood that the number of cases being reported currently might not be the most reliable guide to the true extent of the problem, for the kind of reasons referred to here, underreporting, delay in onset of symptoms and so on?
Very much so.
And then if we just go further down this page, we can see, if we just go slightly further up, Lawrence, my apologies. So under the heading AIDS in the USA, the third paragraph says homosexuals, together with 3 other distinct group of individuals, comprise the so-called 4H list of those particularly susceptible to the disease. And then we see them set out. The 4th group there is haemophiliacs. And then the paragraph below that refers to children contracting AIDS. And halfway down that paragraph, it says a handful of cases have developed in recipients of ordinary blood transfusions, and these have provided valuable evidence to indicate that the incubation period for the disease may vary from several months up to 4 years. So again, this is obviously talking about data from the United States, but would it be fair to say that you'd have understood from this that those receiving blood products, i.e. haemophiliacs, and those receiving blood transfusions were in the categories of people who might be thought to be at particular risk?
Yes, although I've also quickly learnt there was great debate within the community of haemophiliacs and others about concerns about blood supplies being available.
Yes, we'll come back to that with Patten. And then if we go over the page, please, Lawrence. If we look at the heading AIDS in the UK... Got it. You'll see there the briefing states that there are some 12 confirmed cases of AIDS reported to the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre. 11 of those homosexuals, some history of drug abuse and contacts with American nationals. 5 had died. The remaining case, a heterosexual haemophiliac, and then it suggests in the last sentence of that paragraph, although this patient fits many of the criteria for the diagnosis of AIDS, there's still some uncertainty over the diagnosis. So again, doing the best you can, putting yourself in the position that you would have been in reading this in 1983, you'd have understood from this, would you, that AIDS certainly couldn't be regarded as just a problem for America. It was already in the United Kingdom, and there was already evidence of it affecting haemophiliacs in the United Kingdom.
Yes, and I think all of that I agree with, and I think that my suspicion at the time would be this is going to spread, and we must be prepared, but I've got no document that says that, or no instruction to ministers that says that.
And then, if we look towards the bottom of the page, we just pick up the heading steps which are being taken to prevent the spread of AIDS in the UK. The first step under the heading case reporting is about is about the reporting of cases to the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre. If we then go to the top of the next page, we can see the heading blood donors, and there's reference there to the information leaflet prepared by the regional blood transfusion directors to be published by the department. We'll come back to that. And then we've got the heading haemophiliacs. It's thought that the greatest risk to haemophiliacs at present is from the use of factor VIII concentrate prepared from American plasma, although the Blood Products Laboratory is to be redeveloped over the next 3 years at a cost of 21 million to achieve national self-sufficiency in blood products. Until this time, some 50% of the factor VIII concentrate needed to treat haemophilia will have to be imported mainly from the USA. There's then reference in the next paragraph, Lord Patten, to the FDA, so in the States, having instituted new regulations.
The Federal Drugs Administration.
Yes.
Yeah.
Governing the selection of plasma donors, which were aimed at excluding as far as possible donors in high-risk groups. And it said that the department's medicines and supply divisions are endeavouring to ensure there'll be no dumping of high-risk plasma products on the UK market. There's then a reference in the penultimate sentence of that paragraph to the possibility of heat-treated factor VIII concentrate. And then the next paragraph refers to the Central Blood Laboratory Authorities Committee having set up a working party to consider research needs. Now, in relation to the risk to haemophiliacs, this would have told you that perhaps that there were no particular steps being taken at the present time to reduce or address the risk to haemophiliacs.
I believe that to be right.
Again, I know this is, in a sense, a hypothetical exercise because you can't remember now what you thought of the document, but looking at it now, do you think that you or Lord Glenarthur or someone within the department should have been proactively asking whether there were steps that might be taken to reduce the risk to haemophiliacs? For example, seeing whether there were different forms of treatment that could be given to haemophiliacs that didn't have the same risk?
That's an entirely reasonable question, and without blaming anyone in the civil service in the Department of Health or their medical advisors, I suppose it causes at least a raised eyebrow. Now you ask me that question, and I hadn't asked myself that question, that maybe people should have been putting up advice to ministers to saying we should do something about it. And indeed, perhaps I should have thought that. But there is no documentation, I think, which helps me in saying who should or should have done this.
Understood.
But I accept responsibility for anything that wasn't done.
We can take that down. Before we turn to look at various other documents, specifically relating next to the blood donor leaflet, all the documentation I'm going to explore with you in the course of today is really relating to AIDS and the risk of AIDS being transmitted by blood or blood products. Do you recall hepatitis ever featuring in either the issues that were being presented to you for your views or any of the briefings?
I certainly remember hepatitis coming up both in the context of the Department of Health and also in the context of the work that I was doing on over the period of my time there of health education to try to persuade people not to take drugs. And coincidentally, in a timing sense, David Mellor and me had a working party that met regularly, sometimes in the DHSS, sometimes in the Home Office, to see how we could coordinate better, trying to persuade people to not take hard drugs, soft drugs, any drugs at all. And we worked on publicity campaigns and all the rest of it on advice. And certainly in that, I recall definitely that the risk not just of transmitting AIDS, but of transmitting hepatitis through infected needles and shared needles. and we had a number of publicity campaigns, some of which were successful on advice. We're not publicity experts. And sometimes they weren't very successful. And I can give examples of when they weren't very successful. But certainly hepatitis came up in that as a needle injecting thing.
And do you recall whether hepatitis, or have any sense of, I appreciate asking you what you recall is maybe problematic, of the extent to which hepatitis played any role in decision making about blood and blood products during your time at the department?
I don't think so.
And do you know, again, I appreciate it's a difficult question, do you know or have any sense of what your understanding was of the seriousness of hepatitis or the different forms of hepatitis at that time?
No.
So
Which compares and contrasts to AIDS. I mean, where I got that was deadly serious. Very serious, rather, what I should have used.
So I'm going to pick up as the next main topic for you, Lord Patten, the decision-making regarding the first blood donor leaflet.
1983.
1983, absolutely. And we can start, I think, with DHSC 0002309_024. This is a minute from Mr. Parker in HS1. It's to Mr. Joyce, but if we look at the bottom of the page, we can see the date, 1st of July 1983, and we can see that it was copied to Mrs. Walden.
Correct.
So this went, although it's addressed, I think, to Lord Glenarthur's private office, it's copied to your private office. And I think we know from later documents, indeed, that you read the attached submission because you
It's
commented.
the only name in that copy list, if I may, of
Yes.
the 1st of July, which leaps off the page to me is Dr. Wolford, who I do remember as being a formidable operator. She was pretty tough and very single-minded, and that I can remember.
So if we go to the top of the page, the text of the minute, we can see it says, I attach a paper, flag A, prepared by Dr. Wolford, which seeks Minister's agreement to the funding and publication by the Department of an information leaflet on AIDS, flag B, for distribution by the National Blood Transfusion Service. Lord Glenarthur will be aware from Dr. Wolford's note of the 22nd of June, that's the document we just looked at, I think, Lord Patten, of the steps being taken by the Department to prevent the spread of AIDS in the UK, and a further submission covering the imports of blood products, developments in technology research and UK production of Factor VIII will shortly be put to ministers. Meanwhile, in view of the public interest in AIDS, the issue of the leaflet would be seen as a positive step to minimise the risk of the transmission of the disease through blood donation in this country. So that's the accompanying minute. If we then go to the submission, it's DHSC 0002309_121. And again, I'm going to really be asking you what you think you would have understood about it at the time, or what you understand about this now, looking at it. So we can see purpose of the paper. It says an information leaflet on AIDS has been prepared by the regional blood transfusion directors. Its main purpose is to discourage practising male homosexuals who as a group carry the highest risk of transmitting AIDS in their blood to refrain from donation. Funds are available for the department to pay for the printing of the leaflet, estimated cost of approximately £5,000, which would be distributed by the NBTS. In view of the sensitivity of the issue as it relates to homosexuals, Minister's agreement is sought to the funding and publication of the leaflet. I'm going to come back in a minute, Lord Patten, to that issue about the sensitivity of the issue, because further down the document we get a little more understanding about that. But that's said to be the reason this submission is coming to ministers. Presumably a payment of something like £5,000 wouldn't normally come to ministers.
No, not for decision taking, but it was the general practice in the department, whether rightly or wrongly, I think probably most of the time rightly, that issues of cost for the payment of services were properly those not for ministers. I'm very uneasy in recent experience of learning that ministers sometimes may have taken decisions about this company rather than that company. That I deplore. I feel very strongly that it's right, it was right at the time and remains right now, that these things should be for professionals. But of course, ministers should ask, well, are we pushing them hard enough? Are they acting quickly enough in what they're doing? But not in allocating £5,000 or £5 million. That's not for ministers. And that indeed we were under, as far as I can remember, the very austere eye of Sir Kenneth Stowe, who was the permanent secretary in the department, who was very conscious. And I won't go into describing the sprawling nature of the department because I know that's been described by, it's a waste of your time, been described by Norman Fowler and Kenneth Clarke and others, but it was certainly that. And that means that Sir Kenneth Stowe was very, very challenged always, trying to keep a grip on where this huge department, now split into two, was actually spending its money in his role as the accounting officer. And he could be called up before the Public Accounts Committee at any stage and asked indeed, why did you authorise this £5,000 or whatever? And so I believe it to be right that these decisions were always left to civil servants and not taken by ministers.
And then if we look at the heading background, we can see Dr. Wolford reports as follows: there's increasing evidence that AIDS may be transmitted by the transfusion of blood which is taken from a person who's either suffering from AIDS or who's in the incubation period of the disease. Blood products such as factor VIII for the treatment of haemophilia may also transmit AIDS, and haemophiliacs are at particular risk of contracting the disease because factor VIII concentrates are made from pooled plasma of up to 5,000 donors. And then we have the reference to the number of cases and the belief in underreporting. And then the next paragraph begins, although there is no conclusive evidence, it seems very likely that AIDS is caused by an as yet unidentified virus. Now, just pausing there, Lord Patten, I'm going to come on later to that phrase, no conclusive evidence.
Right. Got it.
And then Dr. Wolford explains there's no test, and she says in the absence of such a test, blood transfusion directors are anxious that information on AIDS should be made available to blood donors, and that promiscuous male homosexuals, who as a group carry the highest risk of transmitting AIDS in their blood, should be discouraged from donating. There's absolutely no intention, however, that donors should be questioned about their sexual habits or be required to undergo a routine physical examination. And then there's a reference to the leaflet itself. If we just go further down the page, please, Lawrence. There's reference there to a draft resolution of the Council of Europe. Again, I'm going to come back to that issue, Lord Patten. And then we've got the heading sensitive issues at the bottom of the page. It's possible that a request to homosexual donors to refrain from donating could be interpreted by homosexual rights groups as a discriminatory move, which would infringe their rights as individuals to donate their blood. Such a reaction, over the page, would be more likely to arise if there were widespread misunderstanding of the nature of the problem posed by AIDS, and the transfusion directors are anxious to preempt such misunderstanding by publishing their information leaflet as quickly as possible. The directors have secured the full cooperation of the Gay Medical Association, who've undertaken to disseminate information on AIDS and draw attention to the need for homosexuals who suspect they may be at risk from AIDS to refrain from donation. And then the heading recommendation, in spite of the potential sensitivity of the issue, officials are of the view that early publication of the information leaflet is in the best interests of the public health. And then we can see ministers are asked to agree to the funding and publication by the Department of the Information Leaflet for distribution.
Could I just observe that the phrase likely to arise if there were widespread misunderstanding of the nature of problems posed by AIDS, I think there was already by this time pretty widespread misunderstanding, and without preempting later discussions, I think it grew, if not exponentially, very fast over the period up to 1985 when I left the department. And there was such widespread misinformation that certainly some time after this minute was put up, and probably some time after the leaflet was issued, but it's a good example. There was a lot of misunderstanding that AIDS could be transmitted by shaking hands. And I can remember, and it must be findable because there were very few television companies around in 1983, that I was asked to go on to an interview, which I duly did, and I can remember seeing it rerun for my vision myself, and actually to talk to an AIDS sufferer and to shake hands with him, which I was happy to do because medical advice was it was perfectly safe and AIDS could not be transmitted by shaking hands. Bizarre thought that it could do. And in the typical media way, I can remember this very clearly in my mind because it was to do with me and what I was doing, I guess, that the camera zoomed in on our hands shaking as though this was a matter of fundamental importance, which was completely wrong. But I think misunderstanding grew and grew. I suspect it was an interview in the sort of 1984, 1985 period on the 2 or 3 channels that were available.
So looking at this document, the reference to sensitivity and sensitive issues and the matter coming to ministers because of the sensitivity, is it right to understand that that was the fear that there'd be criticism from the gay community about homosexuals being asked not to donate blood? Is that right?
Yes. Yes. There was also fear, I'm sure, that we get from less enlightened groups of the community who were not in favour of homosexuality and promiscuous homosexuality in particular, which are a fair number of people in Parliament and in the world at large. And one was endlessly trying to counterbalance that with serious practical advice that spoke to reality. But I'm not quite sure we were always necessarily successful in achieving that.
And we can see, if we just look at, again, at the 4th line, or picking it up in the 2nd line, Dr. Wolford explains that transfusion directors want this information published as quickly as possible, and the recommendation refers to officials' view that early publication is in the best interest of the public health. So do you think you would have understood from this that this was something that needed to be got on with as soon as possible?
Yes, and I was extremely keen that we should get on with it, and nervous is perhaps too strong a word, but concerned that we might be moving slowly on this.
If we then just look at the draft leaflet briefly, DHSC 0002309_122. Now, this was the draft. We've got a date at the top of the page, 24th of June 1983. If we just go down to the bottom half of the page, please, Lawrence. Under the heading, Who is at risk from AIDS? And picking that up 3 lines down, certain groups of people appear to be particularly susceptible. These are, 1, homosexual men who have many different partners. Now, it might be said that that was too narrow a group, because only those who were promiscuous, to use a term that appears from time to time, or had lots of different partners, might think that they were at risk. Do you remember whether that was something which, or do you know whether that was something that occurred to you or colleagues in the department at the time? Was that picked up on, that particular wording?
I don't recall that.
Do you see, looking at it in hindsight, the force of the point that might not exclude enough people, that wording?
With hindsight, yes, it's manifest that they should have been, more groups should have been listed.
And then if we go over the page and we look at the heading halfway down the page, can AIDS be transmitted by transfusion of blood and blood products? The answer to that is given as almost certainly yes, and then a distinction is drawn between ordinary blood transfusions, where it said there's only the most remote chance, and then haemophiliacs, who halfway down the paragraph it said are more susceptible to AIDS because they need regular injections of a product called factor VIII. This is made from plasma obtained from many donors. Should just one of the donors be suffering from AIDS, then the factor VIII could transmit the disease. So would you accept there's no there's no doubt really being expressed here about the connection between blood products and transmission of AIDS, is there?
Well, in the almost certainly, there's a kind of fudging, and it's perhaps might have been drafted more clearly, more decisively, in exceptional cases or whatever. But I suppose the author of the minute was trying to cover themselves, quite rightly, against every eventuality. And I guess he or she would at the time not have been allowed to say by his or her medical colleagues within the department that it was absolutely certain, because the research hadn't been done. More research needs to be done. The way in which the scientific community quite rightly reviews what it's doing, and there's peer review and all the rest of it. So I suppose there was a bit of a cover there, but it might have been more beneficial, and this is complete hindsight, and I don't blame anyone at all. I might have thought that myself as the drafter of this paper, that one might have tried to find a clearer steer to give to ministers.
And just so you know, Lord Patten, when we come on to look at the no conclusive proof line to take, I'll ask you to reflect in due course on that as compared to the terminology used here. But we'll deal with that later. If we just go to the bottom of the page, we can see under the heading, how can the risks be reduced?
Well, just before you do, there's perhaps a further question which emerges from looking at this paragraph. Could we just go back to the full? Thank you. What they said, there's a most remote chance of happening with ordinary blood transfusions given in hospital, and then the word is however, and it deals with those people who had haemophilia, and it says nothing there about the chance that they might get AIDS. So the quick reader might think that there was a remote or very slim chance that they would.
In which risk?
The quick reader
Yes.
might think that there was a very slim chance that they would get AIDS as a result of receiving a blood product, whereas it's not actually what the paragraph says, I think.
No, I take your point.
Because it's got the word however, which suggests there's a distinction to be drawn. Not perhaps the clearest of drafting.
No, and in all sorts of contexts, whether it's political or legal or whatever, the word however is sometimes a dangerous word to use, and people stick it in because they can slither out and say, I stuck a however in.
Yes.
But I fully take the point, which I hadn't appreciated, that a quick reader might have taken something that wasn't intended.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then picking it up, Lord Patten, at the bottom of the page, under the heading, how can the risks be reduced? At present, there is no screening test the transfusion service can use to detect people with AIDS. So until there is, and until more is, top of the next page, known about this disease, donors are requested not to give blood if they think they may either have the disease or be at risk from it. Now, again, Lord Patten, it might be said that request not to give blood if you think you've got AIDS or are at risk from it was too tentative in terms of language, and that something stronger, essentially saying donors must not give blood if they fall within those categories, would have been a better form of wording. Do you know whether that's something that was considered at the time?
I don't.
Looking at it now, do you have any thoughts on that point?
Well, I was in favour, as I trust is clear, of getting on with it and getting on fast, and I'm thinking that there was a serious risk. But I think I must say on behalf of long ago civil servants that particularly at this stage in the development of the science and the low levels of testing that there have been, that I can see and sympathise with them being tentative to a certain extent, because they didn't want ministers in particular to go around causing alarm which might not turn out to be justified. So I can understand the intellectual and policy forming context that those words were used. I suspect turning the clock on, which we can't do another 6 months or a year, they wouldn't have phrased it in that way, because by that stage there was lots more information and we were much clearer. That's my view.
That submission and draft leaflet went to you, to Lord Glenarthur, to Mr. Clark. We've explored Lord Glenarthur's response with him, so I don't need to ask you about that. For the transcript only, and for the benefit of anyone following, the reference to that is DHSC 0002309_025. Can I pick up then a further minute that was copied to your private office, which is at DHSC 0002309_026. This is a minute of the 4th of July from Mr. Parker, again to Lord Glenarthur's private office, I think. But if we look at the bottom of the page, we can see it was...
Just before we get on to that, I'm so sorry. It just leapt off the page. I hadn't noticed it before, forgive me. But obviously, some of this was being copied to the Home Office, am I right? And to the Scottish Health?
Yes,
and
yes.
What does the second H stand for?
Scottish Home and Health Department.
Ah, right. So it was copied more widely. This is perhaps an example of how at official level the different territories were actually talking to each other. Sorry, forgive me.
No.
I hadn't noticed that.
And so we can see it was copied to Mrs. Walden, so your private office, and it's 4th of July. If we go back to the text, we can see from the first paragraph that Lord Glenarthur had been content with the leaflet. I just want to ask you about one matter, please, Lord Patten. So it's paragraph 2B, refers to ministers may welcome some form of public announcement about the leaflet, and there's a suggested oral question and answer. About just over halfway down that paragraph, there's a sentence beginning, as to further publicity by means of a press release, Information Division advise that a relatively low-key approach should be adopted, with copies of the leaflet being sent to selected journalists. Otherwise, it's felt that a wider distribution might lead to further press speculation and misleading articles. Just wanted to pick up on that reference to relatively low-key approach. What do you think was meant by that, and why?
Well, I think it was those advisors in the information department believing, which I think is a mistake, at the time, that if they rang up or talked to their choice contacts in the journalistic world, not to put too fine a point on it, I mean, that was, as it were, the trustees in the journalistic world. And I believe that still happens today in government departments, and that the leaflet would be sent to selected journalists to believe that that would not have led to the journalistic community at large quite rightly following it up and saying, what's going on here? And immediate further press speculation, I think, was not a good judgment at the time. And it's much better to come out and to be transparent and not to try to smuggle things out. And I can't remember, generally speaking, ever try to smuggle things out, because if you try to smuggle them out, people say, well, he's trying to hide something. So,
now
curious words.
Now, we know that there was a...
That's with hindsight,
yes.
And I wasn't involved in that decision.
No, and we know that on the 6th of July 1983, there was a meeting involving Lord Glenarthur and Mr. Clark looking at issues relating to the leaflet. You were not in attendance at that meeting, and we've explored it with Lord Glenarthur and Mr. Clark, so I'm not going to ask you about it.
I think they wanted to take a grip on publicising this, is my reading from...
Yes, perhaps we'll just look very briefly at it. DHSC 0001511.
Sorry, forgive me interrupting.
No, not at all. So it's the meeting we can see, 6th of July, attended by MSH, that's Mr Clark, as he then was, and Lord Glenarthur, and then various officials. And then it's really paragraph 3, where we see Mr Clark making comments now about the content of the leaflet. So wanting it to emphasise more strongly how few cases of AIDS there have been, wanting it to emphasise unequivocally donors wouldn't be questioned about sexual matters, and wanting to minimise damage to the transfusion service. And then the 4th paragraph suggests that Lord Glenarthur should emphasise that the risk to haemophiliacs was very small. So that's the meeting that took place 6th of July. As I say, you weren't involved in that.
Not at all.
However, if we look at the bottom of the page, we can see that this note about the meeting was copied to your private office, because we've got see there the reference to Mrs. Walden. And on that, I don't know whether it's possible for you to say now whether you think you would have read this document.
This is, I think, a classic's the wrong word, a good example of how we were all kept in touch with each other about the general development of departmental policy, and in particular, where if one minister, who, if you like, was the Commons understudy to the Lords Minister, would be kept in touch with what decisions have been taken, so he or she could be informed. If the very next day something appeared in the press, and I was walking through the lobbies of the House of Commons and someone came up and said, this is happening, so I suspect I would probably have been shown this by the assiduous Mrs. Walden, simply because she knew that the temperature was rising a bit in the House of Commons and people were taking a lot of interest. But I cannot guarantee that I did, and I have no memory.
And just picking up on that last point in paragraph 4, the suggestion being made that Lord Glenarthur should emphasise, if asked about it in the House of Lords, that the risk to haemophiliacs was very small. Now, it might be said that's just not accurate. The risk...
He did say that in the answer, didn't he?
Sorry,
I'm interrupting again.
I won't take you through all the various parliamentary questions and answers. It's not said, I think, in those terms, as I recall. He does deal with a no conclusive proof formulation. But the suggestion that there should be emphasis on the risk to haemophiliacs being very small might be said just to be wrong, because the risk to haemophiliacs wasn't small.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't quite catch the hearing.
It might be said that it was wrong to suggest that the risk to haemophiliacs was very small. The risk to haemophiliacs was understood to be a real risk because of the reliance upon factor VIII concentrates. Yes. Looking at this now, would you accept that?
Yes.
But you can't, I think, help us with what your reaction might have been at the time reading this.
I wouldn't want to speculate on that, but looking at it with 20/20 hindsight and properly briefed, my answer to your question is yes, obviously.
So I note the time. I'm going to pick up then Lord Patten's own response, but I think perhaps we can do that after the break.
Yes, well, we'll take a break. We'll take a half-hour break and allow those who are watching to have a coffee and so on. This is the first of the breaks there will be. At every break, I must tell you what I say to every witness.
Sorry, I can't seem to hear clearly. I wonder if the sound engineer could...
Right, well, I'm sorry.
Would you like to shout at me? I won't take offence.
I'm sorry about that. I'll speak more slowly and hope that you can hear. This is the first of the breaks there will be. At every break, you may not talk about the evidence you have given or anything which you think you may yet be asked to give in evidence to anyone, whoever that person is. But you can talk about anything else you like.
Indeed, I've already been briefed that that's the case, and I understand the strictures and approve of them.
Very good. 10 to 12.